Joining us. In case you didn't see the coffee, tea, Yuzu Madeline's outside. We appreciate you coming here today. I have the honor of introducing Ashley Dequilla. We have been working with her over the almost last year and a half here at the Field Museum. Sam, Iris, and I are on a project for the AANHPI Tang project to create learning experiences for young people around Asian American history. My name is Ria Predikin, and I'm a learning resources educator here. And I would like to introduce Ashley Dequilla, who is an artist, filmmaker, and archivist of the Negrense, Tagalog, and Ilonggo descent. She holds an MFA in Moving Image and is completing her MA in Art History from the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is a co-curator, partner, and researcher of the Philippine Heritage Collection at the Field Museum. Ashley is the de facto archivist and collection manager of the Filipino American Historical Society of Chicago, securing the National Film Preservation Foundation Award in 2024 and 2025 for 16mm home movies by Nicolas Galutera Viernes from 1902 to 1991, the earliest Filipino-American documentarian in cinema history. And also, October is Filipino-American History Month. So without further ado, Ashley Dequilla.
Thank you so much, Ria, for this introduction. This is an incredible moment for myself personally. There are a few people here who have witnessed my journey, and I'm super excited to walk you through it today. This work was made possible through the collaboration and trust extended by the Field Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of the Philippines, Hampton University Museum, University of Michigan Bentley Historical Library, and the Oklahoma Historical Society. Here at the Field Museum, thank you so much, Ria Predikin, for opening doors for our community at this institution and for inviting me to present this research during Filipino-American History Month especially. I must thank Anthropology Collections Manager Jamie Kelly for your enduring allyship and support, Armin Esse, Rebecca Wilk, Dr. Eli Suzokovich, and Jackson Krause for your assistance in this research. Thank you to Lani Chen for extending the invitation to become a co-curator partner of the Philippine Heritage Collection in 2023. I must thank my thesis committee, Dr. Allison Nadia Field, Dr. Andrew Feingold, Dr. Anmanuel Ortega, Dr. Blake Stimson, and Dr. Sarita C. And finally, I must share a space of acknowledgement and reverence for the founder of the Filipino-American Historical Society of Chicago, Estrella Alamar, whose legacy endures and has profoundly blessed my journey. And it's actually Estrella's birthday tomorrow, as she was born October 23rd, 1936, and passed in 2022. So I'm going to start this lecture, I would like to frame it entirely around this question that you see on the screen. Who gets to control the archive of American history? More precisely, what governmental agencies, academic institutions, or indigenous or diasporic communities? This thesis reframes the co-curation partnership of the Field Museum's Philippine Heritage Collection as an ongoing commitment that recenters descendant communities as archival theorists and collaborators while demanding its transformation. Since its inception by Regenstein Pacific Hall curator emeritus John Terrell in 2010, the Field Museum's co-curation program has fostered innovative collaborations between museum staff and members of Chicago's Filipino community. Rooted in shared authority and participatory ethics, the initiative has generated community-led programming, collection tours, oral history recordings, and exhibitions. Co-curation is activated through ongoing discussions and educational programming such as today's lecture, renewing the field's long-term commitment to shared authority through an inclusive and reparative museological practice. My research today focuses on Dr. William Jones, one of its earliest collectors, which began as a seminar paper for my art history thesis. This project emerged from years of hands-on archival digging, handling fragile ephemera, reading colonial correspondences, and uncovering visual echoes across crates untouched for decades. In the process, I began to see not just Jones's story, but my own. A Filipinx American artist and art historian reckoning with the entanglement of memory, empire, and image. Dr. William Jones embodies the profound tension of double consciousness as articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois, a psychic and social condition of existing between two opposing identities and worlds, Born at Salt Creek near Stroud, Oklahoma, on Sac and Fox Agency, 26 miles east of Oklahoma City, to a half Meskwaki father and mother of Welsh and Scottish descent, he was given the name Megathiawa, or Black Eagle. Raised by his paternal grandmother, Katikwa, and great-grandfather, Washihoa, chief of the Sac and Fox, Jones was steeped in the language, traditions, and medicine of his people, but shaped by the duality of his indigenous heritage and the pressures of colonial assimilation. At age 10, Jones was sent to the Indian School at Newton, Kansas, and later spent 3 years at the Quaker-ran White's Indiana Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana, followed by a brief stint as a cowboy during his teenage years. His early life abruptly reoriented when, at the age of 18, his father enrolled him at the Hampton Normal Institute in Virginia, a key site for the assimilationist project designed to civilize Native American and African American students through Western education and Christian doctrine. Jones's conversion to Episcopalianism and his elite academic success reflect this complex and painful negotiation between indigenous identity and colonial assimilation. As valedictorian of his class at Hampton, he would later attend Phillips Academy, Harvard University, and Columbia University, culminating in his status as the first Native American to earn a PhD in cultural anthropology as a protege of Franz Boas, the so-called father of anthropology. Jones's rapid rise to prominence as a leading expert on Algonquin linguistics was informed by his talent for languages and the solid grasp of the cultural understanding and etiquette required to carry out civil study in tribal areas. He learned early on to employ the appropriate manners that are crucial in the field because his initial research was conducted among his relatives. This social understanding, or code rather, would later apply to his fieldwork among tribes in the Plains and Midwest. This is an image that I actually pulled when I visited Phillips Academy archives in Massachusetts earlier this spring. This is Jones labeled with the X on top of his head on the rugby team. And on the right, that's him in his dorm room. So I just wanted to share this just to give you like a stark contrast of what life would have been like on the plains at the end of the 19th century versus, this trajectory that he now has like amongst the East Coast elites. Jones's story becomes even more entangled within the larger imperial narrative through his deployment as an anthropologist to the Philippines in 1907, assigned by the Field Museum of Natural History. The United States' colonial annexation of the Philippines followed the violent Philippine-American War, which resulted in the death of over 1 million Filipinos. The imperial project that fractured Jones's consciousness also mirrored the US empire's strategic division of the Philippine nation. American colonial rule established a hierarchy between Christianized Filipinos, aligned with Western governance, and the so-called pagan animists or Muslim tribes of northern and southern Philippines, whose resistance was met with violent military intervention. Anthropology functioned as a key tool of the colonial project, legitimizing US expansion through the scientific extraction of indigenous knowledge systems. Major institutions were sending anthropologists and curators to the Philippines in what was a cultural gold rush at the time. The R.F. Cummings expedition for the Field Museum commissioned Jones's career assignment to study the Ilonggot people of the Sierra Madre in Nueva Vizcaya, a headhunting tribe that had fiercely resisted colonial rule. This assignment would position Jones as both an ethnographic observer and a reluctant agent of empire. His field notes reveal a complex positionality. On one hand, Jones engaged in collaborative ethnographic practices that reflected his indigenous sensibilities. On the other, his journals contain paternalistic and disdainful remarks towards the Ilonggot, underscoring his internalization of colonial hierarchies and the contradictions of his split identity. Jones's role as a native anthropologist, tasked with collecting Ilonggot material culture and writing ethnography for the Field Museum, reflects this broader imperial strategy of fragmenting indigenous communities and assimilating their knowledge into Western institutions. According to the US colonial interior, Jones was murdered in cold blood by the Ilonggot following a trade dispute that had turned hostile. In the aftermath, the colonial constabulary seized upon Jones's death as a justification to intensify its brutal pacification campaign. His death and the subsequent starving and burning of 20 Ilonggot villages reveal the necropolitical logics of the US imperial project, where anthropological fieldwork operated not as mere observation, but as a frontline extension of military sovereignty. Jones's body became a proxy through which the US could justify escalated forms of colonial domination, punishing an entire community through starvation and terror in the name of pacification. A 1971 volume of the Fieldiana Bulletin contemplates Jones's death with ambiguity, stating, "Perhaps it was simply an impulse, an old grudge, a new provocation, a quick strike, and then death. It was over. Perhaps we'll never know." To this day, only a few scholars have directly challenged the prevailing narrative of the US interior, suggesting that Jones's death resulted from a ritual killing rather than an act of murder. My thesis is cautious to anchor itself to any binary conclusion surrounding the events leading to Jones's death in the field, but it refuses to label it as a murder or cast blame assignment to the Ilongot, who now identify as the Bugkulot. It instead leans towards the instability of the official government narratives that have been proven to be distorted time and again. The subsequent US military retaliation following his death is a case study to underscore the lethal stakes of this colonial encounter. Jones's obscurity from the historical canon of cultural anthropology and the erasure of his contributions as a pioneer of Indigenous studies embodies what Kevin Broyniel refers to as necro-indigeneity, the settler logic that memorializes Indigenous death only when it serves colonial myths. This thesis is not a historical biography of Jones, but instead a holistic, accountable, and open-ended retelling of his memoryscape through archival intervention. Jones's remains were initially interred in the municipal village of Echage in the Isabela province of Nueva Vizcaya before being exhumed and relocated to Plot 428 at Manila North Cemetery in 1923, following repeated desecrations of his headstone. In 1948, Plot 428 was purchased by the Anones family, where Gregorio Anones Sr. was laid to rest. In December 2023, a research visit to the Manila North Cemetery led to the discovery of Jones's second and unreported disinterment, to which there is no extant paper trail. There are dozens of marked graves under cement and asphalt in the place of his former gravesite. The research preceding this seeks to unravel the historical, political, and epistemological implications of his disappearance. This work is about questioning the archive for the point of reconstituting the historical counter-portrait of Jones, the Indian martyr to science. Through visual and material analysis within the archive, a forensic-style investigation uncovers how colonial institutions staged and codified Indigenous knowledge and how re-examining these materials through a decolonial framework might serve as a means of reclaiming Indigenous agency. What could a reassessment of Jones's legacy disclose regarding the historical and contemporaneous dynamics of imperialism? This initiative reclaims lost fragments that prompt a critical reevaluation of power and exchange within the archive, promoting a more inclusive and decolonized historiography. In doing so, it reframes the archive as a cinematic apparatus, staging empire in perpetuity, structures that must be interrupted through anti-colonial measures of refusal and re-narration. The image on the left presents a 1923 photograph of Jones's gravesite juxtaposed with a present-day image of the tree that stood behind it as an evocative visual echo that underscores a critical historical absence, the disappearance of Dr. Jones's remains from the Manila North Cemetery. His absence marks a profound archaeological and historical moment, revealing not merely the physical loss of Jones's body, but the deeper symbolic erasure of his historical presence. Jones's missing remains become a key analytical focal point that examines how imperial structures stage and obscure histories through both the material conditions and mechanisms of the archive. The cemetery, as site, functions as both the spatialized memorial and a material witness to loss, but also as an archive that reifies erasure through classification and institutional forgetting. Read together, the cemetery as site and archive operate as parallel instruments of imperial narration where absence is not accidental but strategic. The absence of Jones's remains signals a deliberate form of historical neglect, reflecting a colonial attitude that renders certain lives and contributions insignificant. Manila North Cemetery, the site of this absence, serves as a complex stage for examining these dynamics. Its immediate encounter is intense as one enters overwhelmed by the bustling of streetcar vendors and a sputtering of motor trikes. The hot tropical air smells of trash, diesel, and death. And as the oldest cemetery in Manila, it is a sprawling 130-acre burial ground for over 1 million souls. Yet it is also home to approximately 6,000 impoverished and displaced Filipinos who have turned mausoleums and tombs into makeshift homes. Michael Foucault's concept of heterotopia offers a lens through which to understand the cemetery as a site of contradiction and social reflection, where marginalized lives persist amid the detritus of colonial history. Middle North Cemetery's complex social and spatial reality functions as a layered heterotopia where life and death, wealth and poverty, permanence and impermanence coexist and clash. This object lesson in site-based analysis at the cemetery forms the foundation for the larger thesis investigation, which traces the counterportraiture of Jones's legacy through key archival repositories, Hampton University Museum Archives, the Field Museum of Natural History, University of Michigan Ann Arbor Bentley Historical Library, and finally, University of Chicago's Regenstein Library. Founded in 1878, Hampton Institute became the first Native American residential school in the United States and laid the groundwork for what would become the federal government's assimilationist education policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It functioned as a prototype for later boarding schools, combining Christianization, militarized discipline, and industrial labor as mechanisms of cultural erasure and control. This education model would later be exported to the Philippines upon its annexation by the United States in 1898 through the establishment of its colonial school system. Among the documents and photographs reviewed within the boxes, the first was a one-page student record of Jones featuring basic vital information such as his course of studies, remarks on his academic performance, and Hampton arrival and departure avatar photographs, hearkening the famous before and after photographs of Carlisle Indian School student Tom Torlino. Unlike the stark contrast of Torlino's side-by-side transformation from quote-unquote savage to civilized, Jones's transformation is only determinable by the ROTC uniform that he wears in the after photo of 1892, suggesting the imposition of identity as an agent of US empire. The image of his after photo within the record mirrors a feature from everyday life at Hampton Institute, a 1907 brochure created by Hampton Institute's Director of Applied Art and residential photographer, Rachel Lee Milner. One photograph uncovered by Hampton University historian and volunteer Mary Lee Holtgreen was a cerulean cyanotype on yellowed paper labeled "From Oklahoma 89, depicting the staged arrival of Native students on their first day at Hampton Institute. Although Jones had not yet been identified in this image, the photograph captures a critical moment in performative choreography of assimilation, a visual entry point into the institutional machinery that would come to shape his intellectual trajectory. This image thus serves not merely as a historical artifact, but as visual evidence of a broader colonial project, one in which institutions like Hampton played a pivotal role in redefining Indigenous identity through spatial, visual, and bureaucratic means. Jones, the blank-faced gentleman at the top row center, appears as a familiar ghost in an unfamiliar setting, the place that would shape his destiny. The arrival image of American Indian students to residential school captures a liminal moment suspended between life and death. Regardless of whether students would physically survive the new environment, there was certainty that their cultures, languages, and kinship structures would undergo irreversibly radical disruption. The photograph of William Jones's arrival at Wickham Hall does two things simultaneously. It documents a particular gathering of individuals grouped by geographic origin in a time of profound cultural upheaval, but it also visually encodes the immediate partition imposed by the imperial assimilation project. The image becomes a quiet but potent emblem of what Patrick Wolfe describes as the logic of elimination, and framed as the slow death of indigenous traditions and sovereignty under the guise of forced removal through the civilizing, educational, cultural, and political assimilation. The handwritten phrase, "From Oklahoma 89, provides a historical and geographic marker, but its simplicity also reflects an archival detachment and domestication that reduces the individuals in the image to their origin and date rather than their identities or experiences. The archival investigation at this site attempts to track how Jones operated within hybrid or double contexts. Instead of accepting the photograph as a fixed historical record, how can we view it as an incomplete story, a site of inquiry into the lives and resistances of these students? What were their thoughts at this very moment, the struggles and longings? To what extent would they have already been deeply assimilated and westernized at this point? How did they maintain their indigenous identities despite the institution's pressures? How did Jones move within the condition of empire as he experiences it directly in the boarding school and later as an anthropologist? Chapter 2 examines Dr. William Jones's institutional legacy within the Field Museum of Natural History, which exists across 4 dimensions of material and spatial strata. 1, the Native Truths, Our Voices, Our Stories exhibition, where he is publicly commemorated. 2, his largely unseen bronze plaque. 3, the Ilonggo ethnology specimens of the Philippine Heritage Collection, and 4, the fragments of Dr. William Jones's memory found within the archival papers of the R.F. Cummings ethnological expedition to the Philippines. On May 20, 2022, the Field Museum featured Dr. William Jones in the opening of Native Truths, nearly a century after his death. The feature of his story in the gallery is powerful and affirming in relation to the Meskwaki community's initiatives on food sovereignty and cultural resilience. I must share acknowledgement towards the labor and care that went into this exhibit and thank Dr. Alaka Wali for sitting down with me to chat on the phone regarding curatorial decisions. My thesis compels an invitation to continue exploring the story of Jones's later fieldwork in the Philippines and offers reflections as a part of a broader effort to illuminate the transnational dimensions of Jones's life and death. The Native Truths exhibition will rotate out on December 12, 2025. The temporariness of this inclusion raises significant concerns about historical erasure and memory. What becomes of Jones's public-facing legacy once the exhibit closes? While the exhibition rightly centers the Meskwaki community's sovereignty, the potential for broadening a public-facing representation of Jones invites the possibility of continuing to tell an undeniably complicated story that leads to more questions and uncertainty than answers, yet remains a channel for coalition and reparative historical justice. In this chapter, I use art historical analysis to examine the Field Museum's permanent memorial to Jones, a commemorative plaque that was relegated to the mailroom on the museum's 3rd floor. This relocation reflects the broader institutional amnesia surrounding Jones's life and work, one that mirrors the silences within the archive itself. Its material permanence as a bronze plaque both cements his contributions and legacy at the museum as much as it memorializes the assassination narrative and blame assignment towards the Ilonggo. And I wanted to briefly share some notes from the archives. This is his field drawing, ethnological field drawing of Ilonggo tree houses. And in my thesis, I analyze it through like a trained artist lens in which you can kind of glean his personal character and temperament and effect. He was very sensitive, very meticulous, and that's what I describe. I also wasn't able to read all of his journal, but I did want to share this passage that really stood out to me. On Monday, June 2, 1908, he writes of this woman named Polonia, this 18-year-old Ilonggo woman. He says she uses her eyes and features and modulates her voice when making her plea. She knows the secret of the game like her sisters of a lighter race under other skies, and she plays it well. When my friends depart, they usually leave but once, but she took leave of me twice, lingering each time she did. Do I misjudge her motive? Perhaps I do, and may it, after all, be but a native innocent, gentle, trusting, and confiding. Vamos a ver. She is an interesting subject, and I will study her yet some more. So I invite all of you to read more on this in my thesis after it's deposited and made available online. But I think that the introduction of this character certainly just complicates his narrative even more and can lead to further speculation about his time in the Philippines, even surrounding his death. Moving forward, responsible stewardship of Jones's memory must reckon with all dimensions of his life. By restoring his role in the Philippine Heritage Collection, critically recontextualizing his work within empire, and using his story to interrogate broader museological practices, an incomplete biography is also an ethical intervention. Only then can we begin to honor the full scope of Jones's legacy, not as a fixed subject of the past, but as an active present shaping the future of anthropological ethics, Indigenous sovereignty, and archival justice. Ethical stewardship requires that we dismantle the structures of invisibility surrounding figures like Jones and demand a new ethics of representation that does not shy away from the archive's ghosts emerging out of violent histories. Chapter 3's site-based research is conducted at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, a primary repository for the U.S. Colonial Archive of the Philippines, best known for the photographs of Dean Conant Worcester, the former U.S. Secretary of the Colonial Interior. This chapter examines the papers of Walter William Marquardt, a prominent American educator, colonial educator who was one of the first Thomasite school teachers of the U.S. government's early 20th century education program. Named after the ship that brought them to the Philippines in 1901, the U.S. Army Transport Thomas. Their mission was to create an American-style education system establishing English as the medium of instruction, which laid the groundwork for institutions like the Philippine Normal School and the Philippine School of Arts and Trades. According to a marker from the National Historical Institute of the Philippines, Marquardt was the founder and teacher of the Buroren Elementary School in Leyte, and later held numerous influential positions, including principal of Tacloban High School, superintendent of schools in Manila, and regent of the University of the Philippines. His career encapsulates the technocratic and pedagogical apparatus of U.S. colonial rule. What the official narrative does not capture, however, is Marquardt's deeper entanglement of colonial knowledge dissemination through the visual regime. Glass lantern slides indexing and depicting the alleged murder of Dr. William Jones are among Marquardt's personal papers housed at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor Bentley Historical Library, donated by his son, Fritz Marquardt. A closer examination of Marquardt's 1918 travel journal reveals that he visited the Cagayan Valley to expand the American public school system. During this journey, Marquardt presented lectures echoing the persistent colonial imaginary that had been stoked by Jones's death a decade earlier. At this historical moment, the lore from the Jones affair was still fresh in the U.S. Philippine Empire consciousness, and especially in the Northern Highlands among locals. This study identifies Marquardt as a key figure in the continued militarized and pedagogical conquest of the Northern Philippines, and these glass lantern slides piece together more information about the Jones death reenactment in the following order. The man who struck Jones, the first blow, the other two Jones murderers, scenes of the Jones murder, and finally, Jones's death staged. My close read of these materials reflect upon their deliberate visual choreography, which was meant to instruct and affirm imperial authority, telling us what we needed to believe had happened. Together, these slides reveal the archive not as a neutral repository, but as a machine of meaning-making. They reinforce the colonial tendency to shape Indigenous violence into digestible, moralizing spectacles for Western audiences. The use of declarative language within the slides explicitly assign guilt and strip the Ilonggot of historical complexity. I wanted to share this image side by side with the primary slide that I analyze in this chapter, Jones's death staged. I realized through someone's dissertation that this glass lantern slide is actually a reproduction of a photograph that's here at the Field Museum in the archives records room. It was taken by a photographer named B.F. Nutter, and Charles Hoy was a Philippine school superintendent. That must have been his connection to Marquardt, and he sent it to the director, whoever the director of the Field Museum in 1916 was. So I'm working with Armand to figure out more information, but this is just something that I learned last week. And I also wanted to highlight this image that we have from the Filipino-American Historical Society of Chicago. This is an image titled Kasibo Ilonggot Pupils, 1918, which was the same time that Marquardt was in the region. So it's a really uncanny and serendipitous finding that is haunting me right now, honestly, but I wanted to share it all with you because it just gives context to the other side of my work with the Historical Society. This image is now at UIC Special Collections Daily Library. And in my thesis, I compare it to the From Oklahoma 89 photo, that state of transition before and after the threshold between Indianness and Westernization. Chapter 4 was born from an unexpected turn in my research journey over the summer, in which Jones's ethnographic data was located at the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library within the Fred Egan papers. As a professor of sociology, Fred Egan launched the Philippine Studies program at U of C, an initiative of Cold War area studies aimed to train both American and Filipino scholars to conduct research and contribute to the understanding and development of the Philippines, often implicitly aligning with US neocolonial and anti-communist agendas. Jones's archival portrait within this final chapter is not shaped by aesthetics or formal elements of likeness and visual materials, but rather the racial index production of the other. Thus, this chapter serves as a shadow archive for Jones's ethnographic fieldwork and scientific records found within the Fred Egan papers that account for the distortion and disenfranchisement of the indigenous communities left in its wake. This first research visit uncovered ancestral remains, 29 envelope packets of Igongot hair samples taken by then University of Chicago PhD anthropology student Robert Bradford Fox in 1948. Fox, an indelible giant of Philippine archaeology, had been studying and transcribing Jones's fieldwork as he toured the area. The reactions to the contents of the folder at this moment was visceral: spiritual grief, horror, and immediate prayer. Concern was immediately raised to staff upon returning Box 117, and the Special Collection archivists corresponded with an apology and unequivocal agreement that the hair samples do not belong within their holdings. They later shared that the Egan papers finding aid was written in 1995, and no one had noticed the entry until it was flagged within this research 30 years later. Although Jones himself had not committed these actions, these samples are a direct result of his anthropological penetration into the East Cordilleras Ilongot society. This finding also becomes a critical window for seeking truth and reconciliation towards Philippine ancestors held here at the Field Museum of Natural History, 10 of which were confirmed to have been attributed to Dr. Jones. This thesis establishes a baseline for connecting with the living descendants of the Igongot and Bukulot communities to inform them of their ancestral remains within both the University of Chicago and the Field Museum of Natural History, and to follow their lead and wishes as to the next steps. Common to indigenous cultures around the world is the belief that one's hair is a source of physical and spiritual power. Anthropologist William Henry Scott writes of the significance of long hair in the pre-colonial Cordillera societies. To cut it was a sign of the deepest mourning or punishment. Within the context of the personal understanding, hair is loaded with ancestry and used in ritual spell work. It is by no means neutral or dead material. In 2022, Harvard Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology faced a very intimate and very painful reckoning towards its Woodbury collection of several hundreds of human hair samples, the majority taken from Native American residential schools. The Peabody explains much of this work was carried out to support directly or indirectly scientific racism. Descriptions and measurements of hair types were used to justify racial categories and hierarchies. Although the polyvalence of uncovering the Igongot remains is painful and re-traumatizing, there is solidarity within the alignment for justice between cultural advocates at the Peabody and the advocacy for the ancestors found within the Egan papers. The stewardship of ancestral remains is a sacred obligation. The political stakes of this project are immediately elevated and actively demand reparative measures beyond scholarship and research. Clear and legal institutional protocols for ancestral remains within the archives are historically a case-by-case matter and rarely successfully culminate in straightforward resolution or closure. These are the material consequences to US colonial anthropology in the Philippines, as knowledge extraction transforms people into artifacts and objects. The vastness of the imperial archive accumulation maintains the obscurity of its subjects, frozen in the past. Restitution, refusal, or the right to destruction is a way to hold accountability for these historical injustices. The subject of international repatriation for Philippine ancestral remains has seen a critical shift in academic policy and discourse in recent years, which is summarized in this timeline that I'm sharing. The ancestral remains within the archive of the Egan papers and Jones's complicated legacy in collecting for the Field Museum remains poses the core question of David Thomas Hearst's Skull Wars. Who gets to control the archive of American history? More precisely, what governmental agencies, academic institutions, or Indigenous or diasporic communities? As an Indigenous person turned trained anthropologist, at what point did Jones's ethical compass cross the line of ancestral sanctity in the name of science? In July 2025, the Dipukolao-Igonga Tribal Association in Aurora Province was informed of these findings and offered service towards the pathways for their returns. Grace Renonos, the tribal secretary, shared, "Many of the names listed on the packets of the hair samples were also very familiar to the elders of Dibudanan. One of them was confirmed to be the father of the elder. They are happy to hear the news that all of the samples are going to repatriate back here to the Philippines." The fate of their restitution is unfolding in real time. The coda for archival investigation within this thesis project compels reparative actions to address the lasting harms caused by the system in which Jones was entangled, positioning the past transgressions of scientific anthropology within the growing demands for bioethics today. The disappearance of Dr. William Jones's own bodily remains, a catalyst for extensive archival trace investigation, ultimately unveils a sacred obligation to honor severed ancestral ties that demand the urgency of their restitution. Through this critical understanding of interconnectedness and the imperative of repatriation through a collective and strategic framework, we can champion sovereignty for the deaccession and pathway for ethical return of all ancestors from every institution. Thus is the beginning of a dialogue towards the Coalition for the Collective Stewardship of Philippine Ancestral Remains, which will launch on Wednesday, November 5 at the UIC Asian American Research and Cultural Center. I'm sharing the QR code in case anyone is interested in joining us on Zoom or in person. This is a very informal meeting, but we will have some folks from the Burke Museum there because that was the first and only successful repatriation effort from the US to the Philippines. So we have their NAGPRA specialist and a Philippine scholar joining us. We also have University of Chicago's Kababayan Filipino Student Association joining us, as well as BBAC Illinois. They are a Northern Highlands interest group, just a global one, and they've done a lot of work here at the Field Museum as well. So very grateful we're working with Alpa Sadkopen. As our ancestors were found out of the refusal of silence, the invitation to collectively steward their return extends towards everyone in this room. Oh, I'm not done yet, sorry. I was waiting, Mario was taking a picture, so I was waiting for him. In June 2025, I had the privilege of connecting with the Sac and Fox Nation community in Oklahoma to share my research on Dr. William Jones's remarkable history and contributions. My first visit was to the Sac and Fox National Public Library, where I connected with Karen Rice, the community librarian. Beyond sharing the story of this research, we connected over mutual experiences of violence within our communities. I would then meet Charles Dukin Harris, the NAGPRA director of the Sac and Fox Cultural Center, and discussed collaborating to share Jones's history in community and institutional spaces. Later that afternoon, I drove 6 miles north and searched for the Sac and Fox Agency historical marker on Route 66 in downtown Stroud, Oklahoma, which mentions Dr. William Jones as a notable member among Olympic gold medalist Jim Thorpe and Chief Moses Keokuk. To much dismay, and strikingly echoing Jones's missing remains at the cemetery, it was discovered that the marker was removed and a Route 66 centennial sign was erected in its place. What does it mean for one of the last public state markers memorializing Jones and the Sac and Fox Nation to have now been erased? This was immediately flagged to Dukin Harris, and I was informed a few weeks later that the marker was returned to the Sac and Fox Nation Cultural Center, which they could now carefully steward within the community. However, until the marker is replaced as a public-facing fixture, the state of Oklahoma actively maintains Jones's erasure. This journey concludes with a visit to the Prague Cemetery in Prague, Oklahoma, also known as Red Devil Country, carrying a small food offering to the gravesite of Henry Clay Jones, William Jones's father. His marble headstone curiously features the Masonic symbol, raising questions of the myth behind the Senior Jones, and furthermore, the Oklahoma Masonic Indian Territory Grand Lodge Archive to explore in a future expansion of this research. The following day, a visit to the Oklahoma Historical Society would recover more understanding towards the senior Jones, who was devastated by the tragedy of his son's death, yet expressed conflict about sharing his son's work, protective over both the value of his intellectual contribution and the sacred knowledge of Meskwaki elders. There is finally closure at this site, recalling William Jones's dedication of his work to his father. Next to the senior Jones's resting place lies his sister, Helen Jones Heffington, William's half-sister. Across from the father-daughter pair is the Prague Cemetery's empty burial plot number 8, where Jones was supposed to be reinterred following repatriation from the Philippines. It was within this empty plot that the body of Jones's legacy and memory could now rest in fullness with his kin through prayer and reflection on what this journey has entailed and demanded cognitively and spiritually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that incredible lecture. We have some time for Q&A, so Todd and I have some microphones if someone would like to ask Ashley a question.
How did you come across William Jones, right? How did you come across him as a subject matter in the first place? And yeah, can you talk about your journey and getting to that?
I had just been invited to join the co-curation group in the fall of 2023, and I was really stuck as to what to do about my final paper. So I was in a Zoom meeting actually with someone who's now my advisor, and he actually picked this topic for me, and it was just so intriguing. I immediately emailed Jamie asking about it and connected with some other folks here, and then just began down the rabbit hole.
Anyone else have questions? Comments?
Hi, Gabby.
I wondered if you could speak a little bit about you being a practicing artist, and obviously all these slides are stunning, and each one is like one of your installation pieces. You know, I feel like you have such a great craft. Can you speak a little bit to the evolution or the emergence of your methodology and how you approach this as an artist, archivist, and through this sort of lens of art history?
Thank you so much. So I didn't show those things that Gabby is mentioning. I've actually made significant amount of artwork based on this research, as well as an experimental film that is screened internationally too. I think it's just it's co-production. It's both like chicken and egg, I would say. It's the research and just like this feverish passion pursuit, also creating at the same time, informing that too. I really appreciate that question because it's actually giving me pause to reflect on what's happened. But I'm hoping what's next is that I'm able to develop the screenplay that I started writing on this research too, because I think it'd be a really cool like feature film, Hollywood movie. So I'm glad to present this lecture because we would need to raise funds. And if people know people with deep pockets that could contribute to that, that's also, yeah, why it's good to present too.
JP, you had a question?
So what do we actually know at this point about Jones's murder? Is there a police report or anything in the colonial archives?
Yeah, there are multiple constabulary reports. I'll go back to these slides right here. You know, there were these 3 men that allegedly struck him. One struck him in the head, one hit his arm, and one pierced his abdomen with a spear, and that he had bled to death. That's what the narrative says. There's a lot of muddledness around this series of events because of language barrier. Also, Jones's translator, Romano, he was forced to provide a confession under incredible duress and potentially tortured. honestly. So there's a lot that we don't know, and I think that's what we need to lean into instead of saying outright that it was a murder. There's actually a quote from Theodore Roosevelt in which he visited the Field Museum and said that Jones's head was cut off. Like he said that, Jones had lost his head because these were headhunters. So there's just a lot of distortion continuing to replicate itself. And that's why I wanted to do this, to decenter the narrative away from it being an outright murder or blame assignment.
Okay, so is there any oral history on the Ilongot side?
There's a lot. There's a lot. And most history will just outright say that it was a murder. It's just continuing to replicate that narrative. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now, to just open up more nuance and more like possibility for speculation around what else could have happened.
So what are some of those speculations?
That it was a ritual killing potentially. In my screenplay, I write more about this character Polonia, in which he impregnates her. And that is, a really grave offense. And he enters into a ritual killing willingly, even though that's, historical fiction, it's still leaning against like that outright stark conclusion that he was murdered. And I think that's what we can do, as long as we're very like ethical and transparent in our approach.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So you just mentioned Theodore Roosevelt talking about it. So I gathered then that these events were like really widely known in the US at the time when they happened. So what was the impact both in the Philippines and here? Like how many people knew about this story when that happened? Like thinking about, this forgetting through time. Was it a really big deal at the time or not?
It made all of the major headlines. As soon as it happened, within weeks, it was in the Chicago Tribune. It was everywhere. I pulled a lot of these headlines from the Library of Congress, and I don't have like a comprehensive catalog, but it was really sensational. He was remembered as an Indian martyr to science for this. It justified the pacification campaign in that region too. It was a perfect scapegoat, but that also led to it becoming obscure as well.
Thank you so much, Ashley. My question is, if I'm remembering correctly, there are items that he also collected for botany here
Yeah.
at the museum. And I distinctly remember one of them being pulled for a members' night at some point, and it really struck me because on the label for botany, when it was acknowledging who collected the piece, it said William Jones, and I'm fairly certain it said that he was murdered.
Yeah.
And so it's when I think thinking about these ways of like the way that words are on the bronze plaque remembering him as well,
Mhm.
and placing that blame and how within the institution we would want to maybe address how we're acknowledging what happened.
Yeah. Was that like a comment, or would you like me to? Oh,
You would maybe as the institution want to address all those different areas that we want to remember him.
mm-hmm.
We would change that wording
Mm-hmm.
to better reflect the circumstances that we were not really sure about.
I really appreciate that. I consider that as an invitation, just the way that this lecture was as well. I think we just need to have more conversations. There should be more scholarship. There should be a movie or a TV series or like a TikTok reels about him. Just get people talking about it, have it more widely known. And that's just a way against working like the permanence, of that narrative assignment too.
Uh, just mostly a comment, but thank you so much for this research and sharing this work with us. it really has me thinking about like when we do go about correcting the historical record and, you know, the like necessity for data entry and those type of corrections and how we can best go about updating things without completely erasing the past, because it is important to remember that, you know, if he was in fact not murdered, that it was portrayed as such for so long. And I just wanted to share that the external, outward-facing representation in a public exhibition in the Native Truth Hall will remain available online
Okay.
via our 360 tours. So virtually it will be there, but we can definitely, I think it is important to also still try to update and maintain that sort of representation. He was a very important person within the institution as one of the first Indigenous anthropologists, but also, you know, he was living in a very complicated time for both the institution and as we're trying to work around and reconcile some of these harms that this institution has put upon Indigenous communities. I think it's definitely something I think that the institution needs to like work around and try to figure out how to deal with all that at the same time.
And that's why I really appreciate just having this platform and what, you know, folks like Ria and Jamie, who have been really welcoming and encouraging to continue pursuing this. It opens more doors and more conversations. So I really appreciate your comment. Thank you.
We're actually working on digitizing the Philippine Heritage Collection with some teens. Just started last Sunday with Chris in our learning center, and we have about 7 teens working on making this more accessible to the public. And we hope to use this in classrooms so that classrooms can access the collections. I know that Faye Cooper Cole was on that first expedition, like mostly collected, you know, like 75, 80% of it. Are some of the items also collected and acquired by William Jones?
I believe he originally collected 5,000, and there are about, is it 1,000 to 1,300 that are now in the collection. But the original volume, just things got traded elsewhere or lost or destroyed along the way. But everything that, what's the name of that man? Sims had gone to retrieve, like the numbers like 1 to 1,300. Sims was the person sent to the Philippines right after Jones's death.
I see. We'll look into that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the talk. I believe you mentioned that his Jones's grave was desecrated in the Philippines, and I was wondering if you could just expand on that. Was that desecration? Is it known whether that desecration was like by colonial authorities, or was it anti-colonial or decolonial like resistance? Like, is that known? I was just wondering if you could expand on that, because that seems like really interesting.
It was from multiple typhoons. It was natural detriments. Yeah.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I thought someone did that. So yeah, thanks for clarifying. Any other questions? Mario?
Hi, Mario.
Was the failure to maintain his grave in Manila, the failure to maintain the grave in Manila, does that correlate in any way with like a loss of interest in his body being useful for a colonial narrative anymore?
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah, that's the hand in hand nature of his disappearance, is that he was insignificant. There was no one maintaining it, no one, you know, making sure that it's upkept, both here in the US and in the Philippines. But that also continues to like cement his obscurity over time too. I didn't want to include other images that I talk about in my thesis, but there's a lot of like global news media that depict Manila North Cemetery dwellers like in a really exploitative way. And you'll see, you know, folks like tossing remains from graves. You know, you'll see like mountains and piles of bones and children playing amongst it. And I think his disappearance, you know, it's a part of that too, but I want to be very careful about how I draw that comparison because it's a really immediate, it's something that you notice when you encounter it, when you're there. It's really intense. It's a really loaded site. It's awesome, but it's also just intense. So I have to think about it some more. But there's definitely a correlation. Yes.
When do we know, from your research, when did you learn about how far back it was last known when he was still in that cemetery before his remains went missing? And are there any leads as to where his remains might be today?
So Collis Davis made a documentary called Headhunting William Jones, and in that he also did some research, and that's where I learned about Gregorio Anonis. And I saw Gregorio Anonis's grave in that same area. I went to the records office, and they don't have any documentation because the events of World War II destroyed everything before 1941, and they, just records are hard to keep, especially in systems like that. So they had just digitized everything from 1990 and onwards. So there's really no paper trail. And it's just a huge void. And that's what this project was about, is just trying to just reclaim some pieces and figure out what to do next. It's taken many turns, and now it's led to like the subject of ancestral repatriation. Honestly, that's like where the stakes are at.
Stacy has questions.
Along that note, thank you for your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Are there any known relatives or descendants, not through Jones, but his half-sister or anyone else potentially that have been identified through this family?
I've heard, like in conversation with Eli Suzokovich, who's also done extensive research on him. I've heard of like a nephew reaching out to a Phillips Academy archivist. I've heard whispers of it, but I have not been in touch with anyone directly. The closest I could come to that was my visit to Sac and Fox Nation and speaking with the community there. And even the librarian who I spoke with had no idea who he was. And that's where he was born, that's where he was raised. It's such a significant history, and she grew up her whole life not knowing who he was. So I'm hoping down the line, I can continue connected with folks.
Right. Well, let's give Ashley another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.